My extreme thanks to Ryan Benjamins, Michelle Durnin, and Ben Rosser for being with us today. I don't have bios on you, so I would encourage you to just tell us who you are, and I will turn it over to them. Take it away, guys.
Absolutely. I'll just get our presentation pulled up here. And Ryan, if you want to start while I do that, I'll let you introduce yourself.
All right, thanks, Michelle. So I'm Ryan Benjamins, certified crop advisor in Lambton County. For those that aren't too familiar with where all the counties are, that's kind of close to, well, Sarnia is probably the largest city in Lambton. Mainly on clay soils. There is some good soil type in the north half of Lambton, so more clay loam in the north half. Then you get into the south half, it becomes quite heavy Brookston clay. So yeah, I have an independent crop consulting business, no employees, just work by myself through Benjamin's Agronomy Services. 42 customers. I do a lot of soil sampling, crop scouting, and just crop planning this time of year with those customers. Possibly one of the reasons why I was asked to present on this topic would be I see quite a bit of strip till growth in Lambton. I work personally with 6 customers of mine are strip tilling, and it does seem in the Forest to Watford area there's quite a bit of uptake. So out of those 6 customers, it's definitely over 6,000 acres then that I would consult on in terms of strip till. So I'll hand it back to you, Michelle.
Excellent. Well, my name is Michelle Durnin. I live close to Goderich, Ontario, so kind of North Huron County. I work with a small team of independent agronomists at Agri-Solve Inc. So Mervyn Erb, Kelly Consett, and Greg Boone would be my coworkers if any of those names ring a bell. Collectively, we cover Huron County, Perth County, a bit into Bruce County, and that's predominantly our geography. I've worked in this area for about the last 5 years in ag retail, as well as actually in some equipment sales. I held a previous role with Delta Power Equipment where I worked with both aftermarket technologies as well as strip till equipment. So I was pretty fortunate to get to demo and see quite a few different strip till tools in different soil types. So I think that's probably why I got asked to speak today. Previous to that, I hail from Ancaster, which is close to Haldeman, Niagara, and worked in that area. So I have a good understanding of our clay soils as well as some of the nicer soils that we work with here, from sharp sands to loams to clay loams here in Huron County. So that's a bit about me. Just trying to get to the next slide here. There you go, Ryan.
Sorry, I was muted. As I mentioned, predominantly clay loam soils. There's heavy clay in the south half of Lambton, but most of the strip till customers I work with are actually in the north half, so I classify it more as clay loam. I mentioned 6 strip till clients. All of them currently are fall only. I have a handful of spring experience in terms of fields that were not maybe intended to go to corn. It was a last minute choice to switch it, say a winter wheat field that did not survive, and it had been soybeans for 2 or more years. We just decided to terminate the wheat and go into corn. So I've seen a handful of experience that way, where people will either just leave it as is, the shank machine that they have, and pull it in the spring. It would be kind of early spring, sometimes when it's the ground is close to being fit, but not 100% ready to pull the planter out. So late April. and the strips would be made and then planted, say, a week or two later. Also, one of my customers that now has the True Ag TerraForge, he used to have a Dawn Pluribus, and when he had the Dawn unit, he would freshen strips in the spring for a while. And after repeated use that way, he realized that he was better off not freshening. It just seemed like it would look really nice on top. It looked like a nice seed bed, but in terms of yield response to the freshening, there was either no response or very little that didn't make that trip worthwhile. And I think that's partly to do with as I mentioned, the clay loam soils. So anytime we're tilling, even in conventional till in the spring, we are more or less just leveling off the top, making it kind of nice, but not too fine. And what we found when we freshen strips in the spring is sometimes you're running those coulters around the same depth or maybe even a touch deeper than we're planting seed. And then we're running into smearing and hard sidewalls from those coulter units. So everybody that I work with has gone back to 100% fall only, unless we have a unique situation where we need to terminate a wheat field or something and get corn in. I have 3 Orthman one trippers, so that is a shank machine. There is the option to pull the shank off and replace that shank with 2 coulter units, but it primarily has been left as a shank and pulling a FERT cart. Same with the True Ag TerraForge, also a shank machine pulling FERT carts. And the one customer that I have with the Dawn Pluribus is not pulling fall fertilizer just because he has dry 2x2 on his corn planter. And so buying the cart would have been an extra investment when he already had the dry fertilizer on the planter. So there was really less of a need to be pulling the fertilizer cart. And it was going back to maybe broadcasting potash in the fall and then having MAP or MES-based dry starter on the planter. So.
That's great, Ryan. I would say when I was doing some demo, definitely the exact same thing as what you just described. So on some of that heavier ground, taking that stale seed bed approach in the springtime. So my experience has been a little bit different than Ryan's, and I think the biggest reason is the soil types that we're working with in Huron County. So we predominantly, I would say a lot of the soils would be classified as some type of a loam. Like I mentioned, we do go from some sharp sands to some clays, but even our heaviest ground locally would still be what I would consider to be a clay loam. And for that reason, I think the lighter the soil type that you get on, the more diverse of a portfolio of tillage tools will work for you. So I find that we have more options that can do a good job on this type of ground. So in terms of strip tillage equipment, we see a lot. There's a few Soil Warriors around. That's a heavy coulter unit, and we'll talk a little bit more in detail about these units specifically later, but those are popular. They come with a fertilizer cart on them. Also see some Kuhn Gladiators, which are a shank machine, similar to the Orthman, and some older Remlingers around, which are a decent option for somebody that is, you know, maybe has found something online at a lower price point. Those seem to work pretty well in our area as well. Also have some of the Dawn Pluribus units around, like Ryan described. I tend to see them on some of the lighter ground, and I think they have a really nice fit there. In terms of how we are managing strip till in terms of a rotation, I would say that most of the growers in this region, and I don't want to speak for everyone, but there's a lot of acres that are in a 3-crop rotation, so corn, wheat, soybeans, as well as a number that are in a 4-crop rotation to include edible beans as well. but the majority of the strip tilling is occurring after wheat. So typically around like that September timeframe, we do get, it seems, some pretty adverse weather off of the lake in the fall. So a lot of folks try to have their tillage done relatively early. So they plan to get those strips made, say September. And then in a lot of situations, guys are coming back in to refresh them in the springtime. And this is predominantly to accommodate fertilizer. So they'd be putting on, say, a MAP and potash blend in the fall, and then maybe a little bit more MAP with some nitrogen come spring. And I would say that's pretty typical. I would say the second most common practice would actually be a spring-only approach. And that seems to work quite well depending on what soil type you're on as well.
All right, so I wanted to touch now on kind of the reasons why you might switch to strip till if you're not currently doing that as a tillage practice. So first off, in terms of yield, some of my customers have done side-by-sides when they were demoing equipment or even purchasing the equipment. They wanted to prove to themselves that it was the right move, that they made the right decision to go to strip till. And so a lot of that trial data replicated on their own farms showed similar yield. I wouldn't say better, but similar yields to conventional tillage. And that's important. We didn't want to see a yield lag, right? Like there have been some that have tried no-till corn, and I would say that oftentimes we are seeing the yield lag. So just to be at par, similar yield is we're happy with that. The next one would be a big one is environmental impact. So in terms of water erosion, having more residue and residue cover, we're only tilling a small percentage of the total field. That definitely does matter. Especially my customers in the Arkona area, there's a significant amount of slope. Most people, when they think of Lambton County, they just think it's completely tabletop flat, but there are areas that are quite hilly and more prone to erosion. The other one is improved water infiltration. So once you stop tilling every square inch of the field and you leave a section in between, you have those worm channels, old decaying roots. It's incredible. We've seen it even when we were doing the trial data with conventional tillage besides strip till, and we got heavy rain events, we would notice less ponding in the strip till section of the field. Another one being improved soils carrying capacity, and this is really important with the weight of machinery has just gone way up as we've increased horsepower requirements. We've at the same time, and it's needed to happen in order to support that big machinery is weight. And so we were seeing in conventional tillage, as people went to center fill planters, you pick the planter up at the end on the headland and you turn around and you're just sinking down sometimes to the depth of your primary tillage. So in a plow system especially, you could see tires sinking in a good 4-inch depth on headlands. And yeah, just in terms of the resiliency of the soil as well, right? We've seen that it's just more resilient to compaction. Now we're to the point where we are loading up our planters with seed, and we're adding, and I'll talk about this later, is we're adding a lot of nitrogen to the planter in the spring. And with center fill planters, ideally you want to kind of only fill up the liquid nitrogen as often as you're filling up seed. So I have one customer, I want to say it's 80 acres he's filling up with of both liquid fertilizer and seed. You can imagine the amount of tanks both on the planter and tanks, saddle tanks on the tractor. There's tanks up front on the tractor. There's just we're carrying a lot of more weight, and strip till has handled that situation very well and held up nicely. The next one is the ability to ban nutrients. So the 2x2 fertilizer dry on a planter has kind of gone away for the most part in Lambton County. There's a lot of liquid in furrow, 5 gallons, that's it. And so we've kind of been missing out on being able to ban a large portion of our nutrients in the last decade or so. And the nice thing about strip till is that we're able to pull a fertilizer cart. It's in the fall when we're not restricted by time so as much as we are at planting. The day of planting, it's all about getting acres in and not sitting there filling up with dry fertilizer all the time. So this has been nice to be able to go back to being able to ban nutrients, and that has brought on a lot of nutrient efficiency. I always like to share this with people that are on the fence, is that strip till, more or less, that the unit of strip till itself plus the fertilizer cart is really replacing 4 things. It's replacing a need for an airflow. It's replacing the planter 2x2 band potentially, and it's also replacing the primary and secondary tillage. Now, I wouldn't say that it's gone to the point that all these customers of mine have been able to sell their primary and secondary tillage. There are situations where you tile a farm. You may want to hold on to some of those pieces of equipment or secondary tillage if you're trying to incorporate manure, those sort of things. But overall, you theoretically could replace those 4 things. A big benefit to strip till in my area, as I mentioned, 100% being fall strips only, is the spring workload. Spring is rather easy in a strip till system. If you've got 2 people on the farm, you can just get acres planted. You have one person driving the sprayer and another person driving the planter. So it's actually reduced the stress in the spring. It's quite simple and able to cover a lot of acres in a hurry. So those are the main reasons why strip till has been adopted.
And I would definitely echo all of those points that Ryan made. The growers that I've been working with, it's certainly the same reason that they've gone to this approach. Another point that I will add too, that I actually didn't include in here, but we do get onto some stony ground where we are. There are some decent sized rocks around here. And so for growers to be able to still get the impact of essentially full tillage, but only be, working essentially a third of the dirt, you are pulling up less rocks too. So that is, one attractive feature. If you can find the right strip tiller for that type of ground that can handle a bit of abuse from the stones. But a couple other points to add here too. I really believe that strip till is an excellent option if you are someone who has incorporated the use of cover crops after your winter wheat. And it's a nice balance, because we'll talk a little bit more about the timing of things later on, but it's a really great balance of being able to get your tillage done while the conditions are good and still allowing your cover crop to continue to grow and have the benefit of it, rather than say it looks like the weather is going to get wet after September 20th. So you want to terminate your cover crop in September and get that ground worked, and then you have bare ground all the way until spring. This allows you to say get your tillage done in September and still leave your cover crop to grow for another month or 2 until it's frost killed or what have you, right? So definitely an excellent option there. And I've seen certainly a lot of growers in this region try to adopt more of a no-till approach and continue to include cover crops. And from my personal experience is I haven't been able to see anyone do it really successfully yet without the yield drag. So, if that's the goal of their farm, is to truly be doing no-till, and have those cover crops and something green into the spring, and that's their goal, then that's fine. I'm not going to say that they're not successful, but I'm going to say successfully without taking a bit of a yield penalty on that following year's corn crop. So again, I do think that strip till helps to alleviate some of that. The other thing too, like Ryan mentioned, like the ability to band nutrients is really fantastic. And I think just the timing of it all happens really nicely. So typically when we're putting fertilizer down August, September, October, we don't have the same stress level that we do in the spring when we're trying to get everything done really quickly before planting. You know, we can relax a little bit, and that gives us time if we want to start playing around with fertilizer prescriptions. You know, we have the time if something doesn't work how we want it to, because that'll happen with technology. You know, we may have that extra 20 minutes to call somebody, get things set up properly in the monitor, and continue on. Whereas, as we all know, in the springtime, that just doesn't always happen. A lot of these fertilizer carts, you know, it is quite easy to set them up so that they are capable of handling prescriptions, and then it'll just depend on, obviously, you know, the equipment that you have in your tractor cab. But it allows you control over that, because certainly some ag retails are happy to work with prescription fertilizer applications, and then some just haven't gone that route yet or just aren't as comfortable with it. So it allows you to be in control of that. So I think it's a really nice fit that way. And I certainly see a lot of folks that end up doing, you know, variable rate potash or variable rate MAP and potash if they have two bins, or if their blends work out well. And then just coming back, like I said, with a bit of MAP and some nitrogen in the spring. And it's been a really excellent fit.
All right, now we're going to go through comparing some of the different units available, or probably what Michelle and I have seen as the most common ones. So as I mentioned, the majority of my customers are either using the Orthman One Tripper or Trueag's TerraForge. So starting with the Orthman One Tripper, I call it a solid unit. It's solid but simple. I would say in general it is solid, but it still is something to be aware of, that if you are in a stony environment, that large stones can still bend that shank. And that has been a little bit of an issue that I have seen. So in general, the frame itself is solid, but the shank, if you're in a stony environment, it may be a concern, or at least shallowing up that shank to avoid some serious damage to it. The adjustments are more manual. You're getting out of the tractor cab for sure, and you're loosening off large bolts or pins to move the row cleaners up and down. The shank itself is a little bit of a difficult time to adjust the depth on it. Most people will use like a jack underneath, loosen the bolts off, and then jack it up or down. If you just loosen the bolts off, the shank would fall right out, and it's quite heavy. So it's just a little bit more manual labor to get it set. But once it's set, and oftentimes that's the case, once you get it running the depth you want it, there is not really a reason to adjust it very often. You may have to change it if you let's say it's kind of wet in the fall. You maybe want to lift up the row cleaners or something that may be plugging, or heavy cover crop situation. You may want to adjust those row cleaners. But for the most part, you kind of set it and leave it, at least for one field. It does have the option to replace that shank with 1-inch wavy coulter. So it'd be two coulters almost side by side where that shank would be. And you could use that for spring freshening. Kind of a unique thing on the Orthman is there's a little bit of a fertilizer deflection plate at the very back of the shank where the fertilizer gets released out of the tube. I was a little bit skeptical of that deflection plate, that it would actually work at first. But after soil sampling in like 2-inch increments the following spring, and realizing that we'd have a huge spike in soil test levels at the depth where we put it was nice to see. I kind of thought in clay soils that it would kind of get deflected backwards and then just fall to the bottom of the trench, but it does seem to stay where that deflection plate is placing it. There are different rolling basket designs on the back. The majority of them would just be a flat bar. One of my customers purchased it with kind of a curve to leave it more mounded, which is actually, I believe, what most of the True Ag TerraForge comes standard with, would be kind of a curved rolling basket to leave it bermed up a little bit higher. So I'm not totally sold one versus the other yet. It is nice to have a berm, but not so high that the planter has a tough time in the spring staying on top or in the middle of the berm. But it is, as long as the soil is contained, a little bit of a berm would be nice. In terms of the True Ag TerraForge, I consider this kind of the Cadillac of strip tillers because it's got more options to it, more from the cab adjustment with air adjustment on row cleaners. Adjusting the shank depth is rather easy as well. It's like one nut that you can loosen off and then fine adjustment with a wrench, and you can slowly move that shank up or down. It also has containment discs, so it makes the unit a little bit longer than the Orthman because you start adding more to it. So these containment discs are on either side of the shank. And what that does is naturally, especially once you get some speed to it, a shank will lift and throw soil outwards. And so there's these containment discs right beside the shanks that allow the soil, they get deflected off those discs and contained to the closing discs, which are another set behind that. The containment disc is not allowed to open any further than the closing disc behind it. So any lifting or considered blowouts from the shank are redirected into the closing disc behind it. The Orthman doesn't have those containment discs beside the shank. The closing discs are a little closer to the shank in hopes that most of that soil would be contained. But I do notice a little bit, it's not terrible, but you will see a little bit more blowout on Orthmans than you do the True Ag TerraForge. And yeah, I mentioned the air adjust row cleaners is kind of one of those features of why I consider it the Cadillac of strip tillers. Just more options, but as you increase options, you also increase the complexity of it and potential repairs as well, being a longer, more complicated unit.
So Ryan, there was a question in the chat there about how deep the growers you work with are running these units. What are you seeing for these shank units?
Yeah, so we're actually not going incredibly deep with the shanks, like about 6 inches. And then we're trying to place that fertilizer around 3 inches, so about half the depth of the shank. I guess once you go, we haven't seen a need to go much deeper than 6. Like unless you saw that you had some compaction issues you wanted to alleviate, but 6 inches is usually kind of the depth of our topsoil anyways. And the deeper you go, certainly the more horsepower requirements it takes. And both of these units, it's amazing how much horsepower they do take to pull. Like for an 8-row strip tiller, most tractors would be probably around that 350 horsepower. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a question there on are trippers available? So the one tripper, the Orthman is considered that one tripper. It does trip, but if you, I'm not sure if I'm changing that slide or not.
That was me, sorry.
As you, it does have a tripping mechanism to it, but it's still, if you hit a rather large stone, like a huge boulder, it's just not going to trip enough, or it gets, oftentimes I think it almost gets bent sideways one way or another. It gets twisted a bit rather than damaged. So
Yeah. So kind of like Ryan had said about the Truegg TerraForge being like the Cadillac of units, I would almost say if you were looking at a Coulter unit, which is, that's what this should say here, sorry, the Soil Warrior, that would be a heavy Coulter unit. That would be kind of, you know, what I would call the Cadillac of the Coulter units as well. Works across all kinds of soil types. I've seen it in our geography where we're on some lighter ground, you know, with some sizable stones, and it does seem to do, you know, quite a good job getting through those. Also have a neighbor back home that's been using this particular unit on what I would call some heavier clay and has been doing a good job there. So I would say it is quite flexible in terms of being a Coulter unit. With this, the fertilizer is going to get more so, you know, mixed into that strip as opposed to like that same true band that you're going to get with some of the shank units. These come with a fertilizer cart, and like I mentioned before, have the option for a dual bin as well. So if that's something that you're looking for, that is certainly a nice option. And there is the option to purchase smaller, lighter coulters for spring freshening. So in comparison to maybe the Orthman or the Truegg TerraForge, I would say when you're looking at the strip that a Soil Warrior leaves in the fall, it's a bit of a, you know, a chunkier strip, if you will. I would say that you'd look at that in the fall and say, gosh, that doesn't really look like something I'm just going to plant right into in the spring. And there's pros and cons to that. So, I mean, you know, you have all winter for some frost action to break down some of that. The strip doesn't sink down quite as easily because you have got some larger aggregates there. But typically what I would see with this unit would be coming back in with a spring pass to freshen up those strips a little bit. You know, higher price point on a unit like this, but definitely a very solid unit. When we look at the Dawn Pluribus, that's a unit that I would peg for some, you know, true loams or some sandier loams. It's a really good option for somebody that has been getting away with more minimum till or no till on their ground. So if that's something that, you know, you've been doing, if you've got some lighter ground but are looking to maybe incorporate some cover crops and still have some bare soil there in the spring, that would be a really nice fit. It's typically, you know, a lower price point than some of the other units that we talked about too. So the barrier to entry to getting set up with a unit like this is going to be a little bit less than some of the others. With both of these units, the Soil Warrior, again, probably like around, like Ryan said, you know, that 5-inch depth. With the Dawn Pluribus, you know, in some situations you may get away with that, and in some other situations, you know, it might be a little bit shallower. Maybe the watch out with this unit would be on like heavier clays or wet soil conditions, because you can run into, you know, some slicing through the ground with the coulters rather than getting that nice worked berm like we see with some of the other units. But both, you know, really good, just depending on the situation that you're working with. Sorry, I'm having some trouble here getting them to change. Let's do this manually.
Michelle, were you done talking about the Dawn Pluribus, or did you have more to speak? Yeah, okay.
Yep.
Yeah, so I guess I just wanted to add a couple things. Like I mentioned 2 of the shank machines, and Michelle had mentioned 2 of the kind of the Coulter machines. I guess what I've noticed, I have one grower that switched from a Dawn Pluribus to the Truegg TerraForge. And one of the reasons they did that, yes, there are some clay loam soils that they were dealing with. But some watchouts with a coulter unit is that it can look good on top in terms of it's worked, it's clean, it's level, it maybe even bermed and contained nicely. But it's not always just what the top looks like. As you have coulters and you're moving soil from one direction to another direction, and as you change the speed of the tractor or your travel speed, you can change the amount of soil that gets moved from one direction to another. So this producer was having trouble where it looked nice and smooth on top, but once you move the surface soil away, you actually realize that a large amount of that soil was actually moved to the side. And yeah, it was just an issue that it was no longer centered. And I guess the nice thing about a shank machine is that there's always, no matter the speed you're traveling, it's just the design of a shank is that it's a point in the ground and there's going to be equal amount of soil moving to the right and to the left, and you have identical closing coulters that bring it all centered again. So your entire zone or strip is kind of, it's all built on being centered rather than moving soil to the right and then to the left and then maybe to the right again to make it look nice. So it's just, I guess that's kind of one of the cautions that I would watch out when you're looking at a coulter machine, is that it's doing a nice job and not moving too much soil from one direction to another. So
That's a good point, right?
In terms of other watchouts for switching to strip till, I want you to be aware that if you move to strip till, that the investment is greater than just the strip till and the fertilizer cart. So maybe you get that priced out and you say, okay, the strip till, I'm just going to throw out wild prices here, but say the strip till is 100,000, the fertilizer cart's 100,000. But there may be more, and I've seen it as people have gone to strip till, that they make that initial investment and then I see a year later they make another investment, and a year later they make another investment until they're finally satisfied with their system. And so those are kind of the three areas I've seen people have to make additional investments. Number one would be horsepower requirements. So make sure you talk to the person you are buying your strip tiller from and be very clear on horsepower requirements. If you want to go large to like a 12-row strip till, you're gonna really need the horsepower to do it. Second one would be, I would say most of my customers that moved to strip till, they already had RTK, so they had adopted that, but I've seen a secondary investment in implement guidance. So even where units are matched up nicely, say an 8-row strip tiller with a 16-row planter, those are equal increments. And you can see from the picture on the right here, this is a fairly level field. It's not like we have a lot of side slopes. So originally, some of my customers did not make that investment in implement guidance. And we figured that, well, it's an 8-row strip tiller and a 16-row planter, and as long as we have our guess rows accurate, it should plant right in the center. And I took this picture for two reasons. Just kind of ignore one of the reasons being I took the picture was there was a planter issue with a seed disc or something was not put in properly, and it was just spewing out a lot of seeds here per acre. It's like a solid row of corn. But I want you to also notice that it is being planted on the very edge of the strip. And even in level field conditions, if you are just running RTK on just the tractor and not both the strip till unit and the planter, you will constantly be adjusting one way, and then you drive halfway down the field and you're adjusting it the other way, and you're constantly nudging 2 inches this way, 2 inches that way, 2 inches this way, 2 inches that way. And it adds to the stress again of planting, that with RTK, that was one of the selling features, is that it reduces planter stress. And so having that implement guidance has been so nice that has allowed us just to have that corn row perfectly dead center on the strip. And then the last one being greater investments is with planter setup. So as I mentioned, in Lambton County, there's not a whole lot of dry 2x2 anymore. So there's a lot of in-furrow 5-gallon starter. And the way in conventional tillage, a lot of people were doing like a weed and feed, like laying down residual, whether it be Integrity or Prime Extra, with 28%. And that's how a lot of people in conventional till were kind of starting off the season. They had their P&K down in the fall. In the spring, they have their own sprayer. They go out and put on 10, 20, 30 gallons of 28% with their herbicide. But now in strip till, they're obviously not doing that. And I mean, you still have the option to use your sprayer, but then you're leaving it on the soil surface with streamers or spray nozzles if you're adding herbicide to the tank. And then you got to start looking at, okay, now I may need a nitrification or a urease inhibitor, and that's an extra investment. And will my urease inhibitor tank mix with my herbicide? Okay. And so it kind of complicated things. We also saw a few springs where we didn't get those early season rains. We planted, we streamed on 28, and then it didn't rain for a few weeks, and the corn went yellow rather quickly with no nitrogen. So now pretty much all strip till fall only are ideally putting on about 50 pounds or about a 20-gallon per acre blend of nitrogen and sulfur based blend to get us to that 50 pounds of N. So that has been an investment in tanks and just units on the extra units on the planter to put the liquid down, whether it be Precision's Conceal or there was a Yetter unit for a few years where people were adding liquid that way as well. And then someone's asking here, I believe it's Brendan Zettler, why not put the N with the strip till? And the main reason on our clay soils, we don't want to be with the strip tiller in the spring. Anytime we go into that clay soil in the spring, there'll be good areas of the field that look beautiful, but then you get into clay areas and it's hard to keep it shallow enough and not do any damage. So ideally, we're not doing anything in the spring. And so we're not adding fertilizer with the strip tiller at that time. In terms of liquid manure, so actually most of my strip till customers do have a liquid manure source through finishing hogs. And yeah, we're not incorporating it anymore on 100%, but it does seem to work okay. We are laying it down a day or two in the fall before we strip till. In terms of dry manure, that is a little watch out that you may want to kind of plan on keeping the dry manure into a 3-way crop rotation, corn, soybeans, wheat. Apply your dry manure after winter wheat ahead of some sort of minimal tillage pass to incorporate that dry manure and maybe get your cover crop started. So it may mean that you can't sell your VT or cultivator or whatever it is to incorporate that dry manure. And lastly, watch out would be corn row syndrome and following crops. We saw this quickly in wheat. So it's resulted in people having to make investments to do the in-furrow MAP or MES with wheat seed, which is not a bad thing, but if you're not set up for that yet, it does result in an extra investment. And another way to overcome the corn row syndrome, at least in we're not positive that we're seeing it in soybeans, but one of my customers that has been strip tilling the longest, I did a little bit of a kind of a research project there for a while where I soil sampled some fields and I sampled the exact same locations, but I split it up into 3 different samples at each location. I sampled just in the strip, and this was following corn, so there's already a corn crop growing there, but in the strip, between the strip, and then kind of a blended approach where I would take my 30-inch spacing and pull cores equally, incrementally, some in the strip and some without. And we noticed like pretty well double the phosphorus levels in the strip if we're putting a large amount of nutrients down, say 400 or 500 pounds through the cart ahead of corn. We did notice that, and so it's resulted in some producers kind of over time, maybe every time they strip till, they may nudge it over. If they're on RTK, they may not go in the exact same spot, just to kind of alleviate or spread around some of that nutrients. In terms of potassium, I think it's not as much of a concern. A lot of that potassium ends up in the stalk of the plant, whether it be any residue of any kind, corn, soybeans, wheat. There's a lot of potassium in that residue, and can be leached out. So once it goes through a combine and gets spread out evenly over the field, those nutrients are kind of spread out again, but it's more the phosphorus that we have to watch out where we see corn row syndrome.
Yeah, really good points there, Ryan. Definitely, a lot of the same considerations here. I would say, maybe the only difference for us would be we are getting some nitrogen through the strip tiller in the spring in a lot of situations. So maybe that would alleviate a little bit of the need for changing the planter setup. But we still then have to think about side dress nitrogen as well too, rather than, like you said, putting everything on ahead of time as a weed and feed or broadcast, then going to some sort of a side dress tool or a Y drop system. And Ryan said it, but just to hit it home, because there will be people that listen to a presentation like this and still want to get started in strip till without making the full investment into some of the guidance systems. And I would say this is very, very typical of what you might see. The first year is somebody just trying strip till to see if it'll work on their ground without making the full investment into RTK. So this was a situation where this was strip tilled on RTK, but the planter was not, and the fellow just tried to set an A-B line, but then eventually you get off, and you can't see it great here, but certainly in this field, this corn here, right, like it's just kind of at the spike stage. It's about a leaf behind this on the left, so definitely can hurt you in terms of yield. So I would say if you're serious about this approach, then the guidance systems can't be left behind as well. And yeah, so like I said, think about side dress. And another thing to be aware of, and I always tell people this because, I'm sure Ryan, you're the same. We get asked a lot about different types of tillage systems, what our favorite tillage tools are, what our favorite programs. And I always try and tell people, you really have to know your operation, know the manpower that you have available, and kind of know yourself. I would say that strip till is certainly a program that requires a little bit more patience, potentially in terms of harvest conditions, because if you're out there and you're making a mess at harvest time, well, it's a little bit harder to, rectify some of those ruts that you've made with a strip tiller than it is, say, if you were going out and just plowing afterwards, right? And that also translates to the type of ground that you have too. Ryan, you work with on definitely heavier ground that probably stays a bit wetter. And so maybe you could speak to this better, but I would say I personally, have seen more success with folks that have, say, a greater percentage of tiled ground so that they're not out, making some of those messes in the fall, or at least have the capacity to get all their crops harvested in a timely fashion, just so they're not running into some of those situations. Talking about manpower too, definitely, strip till is a program that can alleviate the workload a little bit, but I would say that it also takes a little bit more skilled labor, because instead of just having somebody out in the spring on a cultivator, well, now you've got someone that has got to be able to run these guidance systems, potentially know how to transfer A-B lines, and if you're in a situation with dry fertilizer, has now got a fertilizer tank on there, which may run into blockages, is going to need filled. So it takes a little bit more skilled labor too. So that's why I say, know your operation and know if it's something that you can facilitate in that capacity. And then the last thing too, as we know, when you move to more of a no-till system, your weed pressure changes from when you are in more of a conventional till system. And so this on the right would have been a cornfield in the spring. And we're dealing with things like wild carrot, we're dealing with a greater abundance of weeds like thistles. And so it's something that you have to manage. And fortunately, we have an abundance of good herbicides that we can use, but it does require changing things up a little bit just to manage some of these tougher to control weeds. So I think that's all I had for watchouts there. Anything else to add, Ryan?
No, I really like how you brought the point up on skilled labor. What I have seen happen is in conventional tillage, you can pretty well hire almost anybody to run your falls. Like maybe plowing takes definitely some skill, but in terms of disking or disc ripping, it doesn't take a whole lot of skill. Maybe to get it set up, yes, but once it's going and you have your AB lines, you just go till the field until it's tilled. But in strip till in the fall, and that can be a little bit of a busy time as well. If like I see, most of my strip till happens after soybeans going to corn the year following. That is right during harvest. So it has kind of pulled some of the skilled labor out of a combine and into the strip till. And oftentimes the person in the strip till machine in the fall is the same person that's planting in the spring. Because people kind of all plant in different fashions, and it's nice to know, both from a technology perspective, that you have the same AB lines on headlands, especially curved headlands, that you have the same person in that seat that does it in the exact same order that you would plant it. So, and also gets complicated if you're, say, strip tilling with something that's not equal increments. Like if you are with a 16-row planter and say 8-row, you have to do everything twice and equal increments that way. So it certainly does take more skilled labor to do that tillage pass.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Sorry, my mouse is being temperamental. It's been work for it today. What have we got here, Ryan?
Yeah, kind of one of the, and it was actually brought up as a question in the chat that we haven't addressed yet, is, and one of the questions was, any advantages or disadvantages to spraying UAN versus placing it in the strip or row? And here's just a very visual. This is actually more of a sand soil in the Warwick area, and you can see quick early season response to that nitrogen and sulfur, where the producer started the field and realized, oh no, I don't have my fertilizer on yet, so turn it on, and it's just very visual. And I'm not quite certain that we would see this as much visual difference if it was just streamed on top. You can see how there are times, some years, you may not have a whole lot of rainfall between planting and the time the corn is, say, this stage, say 4 or 5 leaf, right? So the advantage to having it either in the strip or on the planter, those mobile nutrients even early in the season, does allow for that early season growth to just kind of take off. So
yeah, that's an excellent point. Absolutely. I think, anyone who has put, like you said, one of those conceal systems on the planter, I don't know too many people that have been disappointed in their yields since that, eh?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in terms of when to strip till, I will go through it. You pretty much can strip till any time ahead of any crop, but the majority of what I see happening is producers going from soybeans to corn. That's this. One of my customers sent me this photo this fall with a thumbs up. It's stripping nice. It's rather easy to make good strips following soybeans. there's some residue there, but not so much that it's an issue. Sometimes I find in winter wheat, and it's not even so much about the cover crop, it's actually more about where people are baling straw and we don't have chaff spreaders on the combine. And we just have so much chaff in that windrow that you come back even a month later and you think you've gone through a dry period. It's amazing how much moisture there is under the chaff, and that has kind of been a little bit of a greater challenge to produce nice looking strips that are uniform, and especially with the shank machine that don't just slice open and have a big slot in the ground, right? You want the soil to be, you want the berm to be clean. You want it to be somewhat incorporated or mixed. And you don't want too much blowout. And the issue in the wheat with the chaff is just simply not getting the incorporation. We can, with the road cleaners, we can clean it off, we can make it bare, but you're just not getting that actual tillage action when it's that wet and slimy under that chaff. After wheat with a cover crop, actually a couple weeks ago, or maybe a week ago, Michelle and I had a quick little meeting to discuss how we were going to do this presentation. And even from that meeting, it was an eye-opener for me. Was I think we need to move to strip tilling earlier after wheat. Like, get the cover crop established, yes, but we don't have to do it so late in the fall. And I'll show some pictures, maybe it's my next slide, of different timings that you can do it after wheat. You can spray it off so it's dead brown, or you can strip till when it's small, which is what I want to target, or I've seen it often done when the cover crops are almost knee high, and that sometimes can be a challenge as well. Corn on corn, I've seen that work very well, especially the producer that's been doing it is using a chopping corn head. I'm not saying that the chopping corn head is an absolute necessity, but in his system, it does seem to at least do really nice strips in corn on corn. And I would like to experiment strip tilling ahead of soybeans. I'm not exactly sure how we would do this, if it would be like twin row 30-inch. There is one 20-inch strip till machine in Lambton County that I'm aware of, and he might be a producer that would maybe benefit from strip tilling after corn ahead of soybeans. It would be a way to experiment with some banding of nutrients in the fall ahead of soybeans, and just dealing with the residue rather than I've kind of seen a recent years of growth on the amount of tillage happening in the fall after corn. And if that's really needed, then I don't see why we couldn't use the strip tiller, other than row spacing right now is limiting us of 15-inch on either side of that strip. Your soybean row may be right on the edge of it, right? If it's or not even, if that zone is say only 8 inches wide, yeah, you wouldn't even have, it wouldn't even be right on the edge. So it would have to maybe be something like twin row 30s or something. So, but it's an area I'd like to experiment a little with.
Yeah, I've seen a little bit of it here, Ryan, with twin row 30 inches for soybeans and for white beans too, actually. Obviously with the whites, then, photo degradation of some of those herbicides we're using in the edible bean crop is a challenge, but it is something that I have seen here. There is a couple of your photos there if you want to elaborate on them.
Yeah, so the photo on my left here is, this is following a cover crop after winter wheat, but it was completely sprayed off well in advance of being strip tilled. The producer's comments, this is actually the same producer. He used to just till with it. Maybe this was sprayed like a day or two ahead of the strip till machine. And he's found that having it completely dead has produced nicer strips than strip tilling into something where like oats are in head. radishes. There'll be some off types and stuff gone to flower, like quite advanced tall cover crops. Right here, it doesn't look too bad, but you just see more variability. There'll be areas where it looks nice, and then there's areas where it doesn't look so great. And the producer's comment was, it strip tills so much better when I kill the cover crop, and it's dead, well ahead of strip tilling. But the downside to this, and the reason I want to maybe move towards strip tilling in like early September, maybe it will strip till this nice, and you've got your tillage out of the way. You can see even here, there's a little bit of mud sticking to the tires here. This was mid-October last year. And yeah, once we get to late October, it gets to be a greater challenge to find the right time to strip till. And also from a workload perspective, this producer mid-October was right in the middle of soybean harvest, with strip tilling soybean ground. Be nice to have all the wheat ground strip tilled before we jump into soybean harvest, and all those fields after soybeans that need to get strip tilled. So it just spreads out the workload, and I think it will strip till nicer when the cover crops are small rather than really large like this picture.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with those comments. And that's more and more what we're seeing in this area. So like I had mentioned before, you know, the majority of the strip tilling that happens in this geography is going to be after wheat. And I'll call it the program because this is what I would say would be my preference to see, and what I think a lot of folks are finding to help them be the most successful. So the first being, you know, after the wheat comes off, letting that volunteer wheat regrow a little bit. And if you've got some dandelions or different weeds out there, getting a burn down on them at that time is definitely helpful. You know, then drilling in the cover crop and not being in too big of a panic to get it done early. You know, I don't think that there's any big pressure to directly follow the combine with the cover crop, unless you were in a situation where, you know, you needed the forage for feed. But when it's just straight for a cover crop, I don't think there's any big panic. But yeah, get that done, you know, by say the middle of August, third week of August. Let those oats or that cover crop mixture grow up a little bit. And then once they're established, say early to mid-September, seems to be kind of the sweet spot to get some of that strip till work done. Usually by the time we get to September, not always, but usually maybe we've had a rain or two just to soften things up so they aren't maybe quite as dry as what it would be, you know, middle of August. But yeah, a nice time to get that done ahead of harvest season and ahead of, you know, the precipitation that we tend to get once we get into October. And then, you know, quite often folks will, you know, let those oats grow or let that cover crop grow. In some situations, depending on how much volunteer wheat has regrown or the weed pressure of that farm, sometimes folks will go back in with a second fall burn down. And I wouldn't say that this is, you know, not just localized to strip till. You'll see folks do that in other tillage situations as well, just to deal with the volunteer wheat or deal with some problem weeds. But with the strip till, you do have to be careful because if it gets wet, say, you don't want to be in there spraying and then ruin some of the strips that you've made. But that is a practice that you will see sometimes too. I have a note underneath, just, you know, treat strip tillage like you would your other tillage programs. So, you know, if you are coming away from a full tillage system where you've typically been doing fall and spring tillage, that's probably the system that you're going to adopt with strip tillage right off the bat, because that's what you're comfortable with and that's what you know how to make work in your soil, on your specific soils. You know, maybe down the road, if you're on heavier ground, you know, you go to that stale seed bed approach like what Ryan has stated. In other situations, for growers that are on lighter ground, it is a pretty common practice around here for other folks to just, you know, maybe leave their corn stalks, leave their wheat stubble until the spring. and then hit it, say, once or twice with a vertical till machine. And in some cases on, nicer ground, that's all we have to do to get a good seed bed. And so in those situations, if you've been more of a spring only tillage type person, spring only strips may actually work well for you. So it really depends on the type of ground that you're on. But I would say the way that you've been handling your tillage program up until now is probably a good indication of how strip tillage is going to work for you on your farm. And like I mentioned a few minutes ago, there are some folks making this work ahead of white beans and soybeans. I would say maybe not quite as common, but certainly something that we are starting to see and something that we can probably tweak as we go along. And with that, I think that wraps up what we had planned to speak about, but both Ryan and I would definitely welcome any questions, and certainly thank you for listening.
Great job, both of you guys. I'll get things started off. Hopefully the audience kind of gets in. I had a big list of questions this big that I was going to bring up. I think I checkmarked them all because you guys answered them all. So, but there's one question I have, and we've talked with a fair number of strip tillers trying to do presentations like this and panels and that sort of thing. And there does seem to be one kind of common thread that a lot of strip tillers, not all of them, but a fair number of them have changed a machine at some point in their strip till career. I'm just curious with the growers you work with, if you have comments on how to, I guess, pick the right strip tiller right out of the gate, or anything you would do. Maybe it's not totally possible, but any comments on trying to get the right machine to begin with, I guess.
Yeah, maybe I'll go first, Michelle, and then you can add if I miss something. Michelle has mentioned numerous times in this presentation about kind of understanding the soils that you're on and the soil types that you're on. So if you are on a loamy or a sand soil, maybe stones are your issue, then I think you need to start with a coulter unit. And if you're on real heavy clay and you don't want to be freshening in the spring, then I think you should be looking at a coulter or a shank machine. I have yet to, I've seen people move from coulter to shank, or I haven't seen anybody move from shank to coulter yet. But I think those changes are rather rare, that you would change within a similar type. Like I wouldn't see a reason to switch from Orthman to Truag Terraforge or to a Kuhn Gladiator. Those units are all kind of similar. They have different small differences, but not so different that you would jump from one machine to another, unless it was completely worn out and you were sold by a salesman on a different unit. But I think you mainly just really need to sit down and figure out, okay, am I going the coulter route or am I going the shank machine?
Those are some really good points. I will add to that too. Watch what folks in your geography are using. Take a look at their crops. Get out there, do some drive-bys in the spring if you've had less than ideal conditions, and maybe compare the way that corn is coming up compared to the tillage program that you're using, or compared to somebody else who's using a different strip till system. And be really honest with yourself when comparing the type of soil that they're on. Where we are, soil type changes 10 miles down the road and can change really drastically. And I've seen a lot of people with very good intentions try to mimic something that their neighbor is doing, but their neighbor just happens to be on, say, a little bit lighter ground. And it can be really disheartening for someone when they don't see the same results, but they're on a completely different soil type. So there's good resources online. I've got one beside me, a soil map of Bruce County actually, but they exist for all counties. You can go on and see that and pinpoint the type of soil that you're on And if you're on a heavier soil type than your neighbor, find somewhere else in the province that has got a similar soil to you and take a drive down, find some contacts in that area and see what's working, because that's the best way that you're going to find something that works, is being really honest with the type of ground that you're on, and finding people that have had good experiences in that same situation.
Yeah, I would echo the trying or seeing other strip tills before you buy it. Most of my customers, and that's one of the reasons why the Orthman is so popular, is because there was one producer in the Warwick area that has been strip tilling with an Orthman for like 15 years, and people saw it and they liked it, and because they were neighbors, they almost got demoed or trialed by their neighbor, right? It wasn't even the equipment sales guy bringing the machine out to demo. It was a neighbor coming and doing 10 acres in their field, or custom work, custom strip tilling before purchasing. There was a question about favorite machine, and I guess that's kind of where I'm leaning towards, is the Orthman. Just how simple it is, but yet still gets the job done, and it's built heavy enough.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I, have a favorite one or the other. I think, yeah, the Orthman or the TerraForge or even the Gladiator, I've seen them all make a really nice strip. If you're looking for a shank unit up here, I've done enough demos, and I've broken enough shank units on some of this ground with some heavier stones that say, in my geography personally, if we were going to look at anything, we'd probably go to that Soil Warrior. But we're coming away from, more of a vertical till type tillage system. And so going to a coulter only unit, makes sense for us on this ground.
There's just a question, Michelle, would you be okay just to stop sharing so we can go back to the gallery view?
For sure.
And then there was one more question. I guess I'm kind of curious. So this is revolving around, I'm guessing, corn on corn, or maybe if you're going into edibles or something after corn, managing tire wear if you're strip tilling into corn residue. And I guess you guys did touch on it, but any other big management things you would want to be careful of if you are trying to strip till corn on corn residue?
Yeah, I only have one producer that has been doing just a little bit. It's been like 1 or 2 fields a year. So it hasn't been a huge concern, because it's not happening repeatedly year in, year out on a large amount of acres. I did mention they have a chopping head, so that's dealing with the residue, but then there are also kind of stock chompers, or whatever you call them. They kind of push the stalk down, not leaving it completely flat, but not that hard, short stubble that would really wear on tires. So yeah.
I'd say the exact same thing. I haven't seen much of it, but yeah, something like I think like a Yetter stock stomper would make a world of a difference if that was a concern, for sure.
Yeah. It would be more of a concern if we started doing more strip tilling ahead of soybeans or white beans following corn. Then it certainly would be something you would want to manage. But for the few corn on corn acres right now that way, I haven't seen that to be a big issue yet.
Great questions so far. If you just want to turn your video on and ask the questions directly, that's fine too. You don't have to type it into the chat box. So let it roll. It'd be great to get a discussion going.
There was one more in the chat. Hopefully people jump in, but just a question about strips made behind tractor tires. If so, could you split your rows to make 15 inches for your soys? And Dave, I don't know if you want to elaborate a little bit on that question.
I know a fellow out Eastern Ontario. He's been strip tilling for quite a few years. And what he has been doing is now he's growing 2 to 3 years of corn before he will then switch into soybeans. But what he will do is he moves it over 15 inches every year. Then he moves back and he finds that the root ball from that first year is basically disintegrated by that time. So he's not worrying about it. But I was thinking along the same lines with the tire maintenance. These new BT hybrids are terror on tires. So if we were wanting to stick to a corn, soy, wheat rotation, and another aspect I'll throw in, there's still a bunch of us that actually use red clover under our wheat. So you're not having a small cover crop if you've got red clover seeded in the spring. So that throws a little bit of monkey wrench into your trying to start a cover crop after your wheat. But the idea being, if you were to go in between, making that strip in between, you can go, a lot of people are going 15-inch soybean rows. So can you, after that row, would you be doubling your time for strip tilling, but you'd be strip tilling down one row that was corn and strip tilling up another in order to be able to make the 15-inch rows for your soybeans.
Yeah, I would think in that situation, most tires I see on the strip till tractor are quite wide. So you would definitely be driving on a strip if you were to double back again in the same spot. And then you're like, let's say your strip is say 8 inches wide. So you're 16 inches out of 30 that is disturbed and worked. You are getting into a large percentage then of the field that's stripped if you were to make a separate zone for each 15-inch soybean row. So, I mean, your corn stalk rows would still be left there, but there wouldn't be too much other residue left by the time you doubled back. To talk about red clover, I actually see it as a very strong fit with strip till, because at least in Lambton, in conventional tillage with strip till, the challenge always is we're tempted to spray it off like September 20th and get the tillage done before the ground gets wet. And we know that the root mass can almost double or potentially double in the month of October, but we're never taking advantage of that because we want to get our primary tillage done before it gets wet. In strip till, there's nothing holding you back from going. Typically what I see in that situation is they mow the clover, say September 1st, and then strip till shortly after that. And so there's not a lot of top there. And then you simply leave it. And from the road, it looks a little wild for a while. The top growth regrows and the strips from the road almost disappear. And then they would terminate the red clover, say late October. And then the top growth kind of wilts down, and then you see those strips are exposed again. So it's allowing us to leave red clover a lot longer rather than terminating at September 20th. So that is kind of the nice thing about red clover and strip till.
So what you're maybe losing by disturbing some of that clover in the strip, you figure you're gaining by being able to leave the rest of the stand until October, say.
Yep.
Do you see anybody? We don't have a lot of red clover up in our area. We tend to be just about a week or so later on our wheat harvest. And what that does is allows the red clover just an extra few days to get up to around the top of the canopy and potentially cause some harvest issues. And I think, enough people have just had some trouble getting good stand establishments. So we don't see a ton of it around here, but have you seen anybody in your area, Ryan, try and strip till in their red clover, say, in August before that red clover really gets too big?
Not quite August, but certainly around the outdoor farm show time. So yeah, early September. There is a question, Ben, in the chat about dry starter on the planter versus in the strip. I don't know if you want to save that one for next week's talk with Jonathan Zettler. Or
yeah. So next week our topic is strip till fertility. You guys might have some different opinions or experiences. So I have no issue if you guys have some comments on it. I think it'd be good to bring up. We haven't totally focused on fertility, so I'd be fine with covering that now if you guys are okay with that.
What's your thoughts, Michelle?
I think the placement is still going to be more consistent on the planter than what it is going to be in a strip till situation. From my experience, though, I don't have a lot of side-by-side comparisons, and I think the reason being is that a lot of the folks that are, going to strip till, one of the big reasons to do it is because it allows them to still just have liquid on the planter, continue the same speed of planting without filling up with fertilizer like they have been, but still get a bit of that starter effect. So in a way, it's better than what they were doing by just broadcasting. But I would say personally, I haven't seen a ton of those side-by-side comparisons. But my initial reaction would be you're going to have still more consistent placing with the 2x2 and the planter than you are going to with the strip tiller. But what have you seen, Ryan?
Yeah, again, like you, I haven't seen side-by-side data comparing 2x2 on the planter versus all of that nutrients in the fall strip. I would agree that probably the safer option or more consistent option would be to have it on the planter, but those operational efficiencies are kind of out the window then. I will say I've done a number of trials with liquid starter on top, like in addition to the fall P and K. And so this is where, say, all the MAP is going down in the fall, and you start to wonder, okay, are we going to have some tie up from that MAP, and maybe we'll still see a starter benefit to the liquid in furrow. And it's actually been a benefit to just leave it off. So we've stopped adding our 5-gallon in furrow pop-up where we have all our MAP or MES-based products down in the fall. So that to me is showing that it's not all being tied up. It's still being more efficient than broadcast. Is it as good as planter 2x2? No, probably not, but it is certainly most of the way there, I think. So in terms of that liquid trial data, we were getting a small yield increase on moderate soil test levels, but not enough to pay for the product. So yeah.
Still have a couple minutes left for questions if anybody else has anything to add.
Ryan, you mentioned on the shank units, the horsepower on those tractors was running about 40 to 45 horsepower a row. On the Coulter system, is it the same amount of horsepower or is it less to make that work?
Yeah, I would say it's significantly less on a Coulter unless you're running like a Soil Warrior quite deep. Michelle, maybe your experience with Delta, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I would say certainly something like a Dom Pluribus is going to be significantly less, because you're not dragging something through the soil and it is quite light. And also, like I said, for the most part, I've seen it on some of those lighter soils where, you need less horsepower in general. But I think for a unit like that, you'd be closer to 8 or 9 would be my expectation. The Soil Warrior, those are a heavy unit. Absolutely, we are still going fairly deep with them. So I think I wouldn't know the exact number offhand, but I think you'd need quite similar horsepower to what Ryan alluded to with those shank units, certainly.
I think there was one more question in the chat again, Ryan, when you were talking about putting liquid on the planter. What rates of fertilizer are those growers usually doing in the fall with the MAP and the MES program?
It'll vary. Some of those situations are with having a bit of liquid manure first, like say 3,000 gallons of liquid hog manure, and then might only have maybe say 100 pounds of MAP, so 52 actual P2O5 in that strip in the fall. Again, it depends on soil test levels as well. And then I've also, so that's one scenario. where it didn't pay. And then the other scenario would be someone that does not have manure, and we would be putting down probably double that. So over 100 pounds actual P2O5. So a significant amount, where if you figure on like corn and soybean crop removal and then either going up or down from that, like starting with crop removal and then going up or down based on soil test levels, whether you want to mine or build. So
Yeah.
so yeah, possibly more phosphorus is going down in that fall strip than you would ever do with a planter 2x2, right? So maybe a planter 2x2 is maybe more consistent placement, but it'd be pretty rare for someone to be putting down that much P and K, and certainly not K in the spring, that close to the seed. So
Yeah, I'll echo that a little bit, just in saying that there, yeah, certainly are lots of folks that are, just putting on crop removal or not putting on anything. And then others that, if they are only going to be strip tilling once every 3 years, then they'll try and get that 3 years worth of at least potash on in the fall, and sometimes MAP, just depending on the situation. Sometimes we'll leave some of the MAP to the spring, and then for sure you're going to get a little bit more of your nitrogen credit out of the MAP in the spring too. So a couple different ways of looking at it.
I have a question. My neighbor has a 12-row strip tiller. I just have a 6-row planter without RTK. Is it a 100% chance that I wouldn't be able to follow them real good?
The wider,
I see it get done. It's not
Yeah.
perfect. It's not 100%. It's not going to be as good as RTK, but I guess try and see if you're happy. So
and the thing you'd have to, or you'd want to do in that situation, when you set your AB line, don't just drive 50 feet, set it for the entire length of the field. And that's going to be the way to set yourself up for the best success in that situation. I will also say too, it depends on the type of strip tiller. Some leave a wider row than others. Like, some may be only about 6 inches that truly get worked, whereas others are going to be, 8 inches, maybe a little bit more. And so even that couple inches gives you a little bit more flexibility, right, in terms of being able to hit into that worked strip. So there is a bit more flexibility depending on the type of unit that it is.
There was one more question popped up that I was going to ask. What are your guys' comfort levels with nitrogen and sulfur in the strip for spring applications with people, with the growers you've worked with? And maybe it differs depending on how it's going in or the machine, but what are you guys comfortable with seeing go down with a spring strip?
you want to start, Michelle? I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't have
sure.
much
I guess-
experience with spring, and I was almost going to turn it right around to you, Ben, because I know you presented on some with urea and ESN, and depending on how it's placed, if it's in a band or mixed, and the answer gets a little mixed up. But
Yeah,
go ahead, Michelle.
We're not huge risk takers around here, to be honest. I think about 50 or 60 pounds is usually about folks' comfort level there, and that being said, we do try and get the potash on in the fall just to reduce having more of that salt in the spring too. But that would be really about it. So I mean, you're definitely going to be reliant on having some type of side dress application for sure. But that's been my experience. Jonathan may have seen more too when he gets a chance to speak next week.